Well, my approach to this very important subject today may be a little different from what most are accustomed to, because I am not a theologian. I'm an educator, I am an English professor, and so my approach will be more along the lines of literary analysis rather than biblical exegesis. So you'll understand where my emphasis is pretty much. I'm going to share my screen. Every day we are bombarded with news of disasters and tragedies, atrocities, pain, and trauma. Since last night, 620 human beings are no longer with us because of an earthquake in Morocco that happened while most of us were sleeping. Of course, we have other earthquakes like the one in Haiti that killed 300,000 people. We have all kinds of reports of disasters happening. Global warming seems to have increased the number of hurricanes we've been experiencing lately. A couple of weeks ago, there were like 4 of them lined up to hit the southern United States. California never had a hurricane for a long time, and certainly this last couple of weeks we had one of our own on this side of the country. So there have been lots of natural disasters that we've had to cope with. Some of them are attributable to human intervention and human activities, but many others are not. Maybe fracking has occurred and caused a few earthquakes, but we have had earthquakes before we had a fracking issue. So we have constant pain and suffering. Sometimes I don't want to listen to the news because, my goodness, it's almost all bad news. And then, of course, there are the pestilences that we have to deal with. A friend of mine I hadn't seen for a long time, when we met, he said, "Man, I haven't seen you since the year 1 or 2 BC." And I said, "BC?" He said, "Yeah, before COVID." So it's as if COVID has now become a benchmark on the timeline of our history. We have pandemics we're dealing with. All of this is happening. And then, of course, the mass shootings that we've been experiencing here in the United States really is disturbing. Over 400 mass shootings so far in the year 2023, over 400, meaning shootings involving 3, 4 or more victims. 25,000 people plus have been killed through gun violence in this last year, and from the first part of 2023. And you wonder, when will this end? When is this going to end? How is this going to end? Is it left up to us? Are we alone? Are we on our own for this? The school shootings are particularly disturbing to me as an educator, because when I hear terms like Virginia Tech and Columbine, and I hear the elementary school over there in Sandy Hook, where some 30 kids were killed through gun violence, and I'm saying, this has got to end. We have had a long-standing issue with the scourge of gun violence in American society. And of course, people say, if we don't learn from the lessons of history, we will be doomed to repeat them. And unfortunately, I hate to be a little cynical, but it looks as if the only thing we have learned from history is that we haven't learned the lessons of history. When the gunman went to the Columbine High School and he confronted a beautiful young Christian teenage girl, and he said to her, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "Yes, of course." And then he said, "Good, because you're going to meet him very soon." And then he pulled the trigger and blew her away. Now, I am only human. And so my thought was, Lord, right then would have been a really good time for you to jam that gun or have it misfire or have him miss, because what a wonderful testimony that young girl would have had to your glory if you had intervened at that point. What part does God play in all of this? Are we on our own, or are we to expect God to take care of this problem? Then I hear in my mind, in my memory, I hear statements like, God has no hands but our hands. God has no feet but our feet. Well, if God depends on our hands and our feet, are we on our own to solve this problem or not? That is the problem that we face as Christians in the world in which we live today. Now we look to our leaders for answers. Here we have a picture of the late Bishop Desmond Tutu. And he was really good friends with the Dalai Lama. And these two spiritual leaders, they had lots of discussions about issues as we are discussing today. And at one of those discussions, Desmond Tutu said, God, for goodness sake, we know you are in charge, but why don't you make this more obvious? Interesting question. Why don't you make this more obvious? Now, the Dalai Lama, his point of view on this was this. When you and your brothers and sisters talk about God and Creator, he says, I'm a non-believer. He says, not relying on God, but relying on ourselves. That was his point of view. Of course, he's a Buddhist priest, and that's his point of view. We're relying on ourselves, he says. Now, of course, he's a Buddhist, so maybe that doesn't identify very closely with our Christian background. But how about the Pope? He is of a Christian persuasion. How does he feel? This is a picture of Pope Benedict XVI. And when I saw this picture, I just could not help but smile perhaps at the overwhelming irony of this situation. Here is Pope Benedict behind 3 inches of bulletproof glass in his Pope-mobile as he meets the people who revere him and look up to him for leadership. Now, I am sure that as God's representative on earth, as he is deemed to be, and as the popes are sometimes considered infallible, speaking under certain circumstances, I'm sure that he prays on a regular basis. And I'm sure that those prayers would include a prayer for protection. But somehow he finds it necessary to surround himself with 3 inches of bulletproof glass. Now, if an assassin attempted to send a bullet his way and God chose not to intervene, wouldn't Pope Benedict be working against the will of God to surround himself with 3 inches of bulletproof glass? Something to think about. But then, do I blame him? I certainly do not. I certainly do not, because his predecessor, you might remember John Paul II, he was shot in a public appearance. And so it is understandable why Pope Benedict, his successor, would take the precaution that he's taking. The question is, why is Pope Benedict hedging his bets by enclosing himself like this in this Pope-mobile? Now, the current Pope, Pope Francis, he seems to not have himself obviously protected by bulletproof glass. He travels around in a normal way. Now, I don't know what that means. Does that mean that he trusts God to protect him more than Pope Benedict did? Or has he taken precautions that are maybe not immediately obvious to us? For example, is he wearing a bulletproof vest under that pontifical robe that he goes out into the public with? I don't know. Maybe he has. We don't know what the answer to that question is. But today, what we're looking at is the issue of theodicy. Theodicy literally means God's justice. And the key question to be asked is, why would an all-powerful, all-loving God choose not to intervene to save innocent people from evil and suffering? That is a question that has tormented mankind for a long, long time. Now, I remember reading the book by Rabbi Harold Kushner, which talks about when bad things happen to good people. Some of you might have read that book. I don't know what your reaction to it was, but I left that book feeling somewhat unsatisfied because the basic tenor of his book and the basic thesis of his book was, well, God is with you. God feels your pain. God is identifying with your trauma. He is there with you in your suffering. But not everything is under God's control. He does not have control of everything. Now, that book left me unsatisfied. I felt really, no, this kind of a God that, you know, the good Rabbi Kushner, I just felt like his God was a little bit too much on the wimpy side for my liking. So I just didn't buy his argument. But then the question is, can an all-powerful and all-loving God choose not to intervene? And why would he choose not to intervene? You know, we hear stories of people who have been in a disaster, but one person or a couple of people might have escaped. You know, maybe there was a plane crash and everyone died except for one person or a couple of people. And that person will say things like, praise God, he saved me from this disaster. God loves me so much. He is awesome. He's powerful. He's wonderful. We rejoice with those people. Of course we do. But what are they saying about God? Are they saying God is all powerful and all loving? Or are they saying, oh, he is all loving, all right, but he may manage to only save me and another person or two from this disaster. Maybe his power didn't reach enough to save the other people in that plane that crashed that day. Or if he loves everybody but couldn't save everyone, then maybe he is all powerful but not all loving. Maybe he loved only me and this other person, why we were both saved and the other people were not. The question is, how can we explain when what seems to be senseless disasters happen to good, innocent people, including children? I hear stories all the time on the news about a young kid lying in his bed and a drive-by shooting occurs and he penetrates the walls and kills a kid sleeping in his bed. It happens more than once. And we still wonder, why? Why? Well, from time immemorial, people have been asking that question. And 3,000 years ago, that is the same question being addressed in the book of Job. So I'd like to take a look at this book with you. But before we do that, let me review some basics that you already know. Let me remind you of some things that you know. Human communication can be categorized in two major categories: prose and poetry. Prose, of course, is the normal mode of communication. I'm speaking to you in prose. When we speak to each other, we're speaking in prose. When you write an essay, you're writing in prose. But when we have experiences that are so vivid, when we have situations that are so full of perhaps sensory overload, when ordinary prose seems inadequate to capture the strong feelings that we have, then we resort to poetry. So when we look at the book of Job, we need to look at the fact that this book is composed of both prose and poetry. Now, early translations of the Bible did not always render poetry as poetry, because early translators did not fully understand the nature of Hebrew poetry. Now, the Psalms were always considered poetry, the Proverbs, the Song of Songs, yes, but there are many other passages that were poetic, that were not recognized as such. When fully understood, 1/3 of the Old Testament is poetry. So modern translations like the NIV, which I favor, will print poetry as poetry and prose as prose. So if you look at the first page of the book of Job, you notice that this is written all in prose down here until we get to a little bit of poetry here. And then chapter 2 is mostly prose with a little bit of conversation up here, but mostly prose. And then what happens next in the book of Job is that we have 39 chapters of nothing but poetry. You can see how the format of the print here shows that this is all poetry, chapter 3 and chapter 4, all the way to the end of the book, where we again end up with an epilogue, which is prose. So what you have is some prose at the beginning, some prose at the end, and in the middle, 39 chapters of poetry. Now, if you were to take those 39 chapters of poetry and set them aside for a moment, and take the prose from the beginning and the prose from the end, and you join them together, you have a complete story in prose. Moreover, that story has all the trappings of what is known in literary genre as a folk tale. Now, I don't use the word fairy tale, not only because it might be more offensive to some of our listeners, but a folk tale has certain characteristics that define it from other kinds of literature. For example, a folk tale always begins with some kind of a beginning that says, once upon a time, and it always ends with something sounding like happily ever after. And then in the middle of the folk tale, there's always some repetitive elements, because you see, folk tales are part of oral tradition. And to make it easy to remember and transmit to the next generation, we have repetitive phrases that are used all the time. In the case of the folk tale of the three little pigs, you might remember as children, you know, the big bad wolf says, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. And he goes to the next pig's house and he says, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. And the same thing for the third. Or in Goldilocks and the three bears, you might remember that. You know, Papa Bear says, who's been sleeping in my bed? And Mama Bear says, who's been sleeping in my bed? And little baby bear says, who's been sleeping in my bed? Well, you have those elements of repetition in this story as well. So now what I'd like to do is to take a look at the prose part of the book of Job. And I'm going to go back to the beginning. And just because this book is a very long book, 42 chapters, and most of you are familiar with this story, so I'm going to be using a broad brushstrokes approach to covering what we need to do today. So chapter 1 says, in the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. That's the part that says, like, once upon a time, there was a man. And then he goes on to enumerate how wealthy this man was. He had 10 children. He had scores of camels and donkeys and lots of livestock, a whole retinue of servants to help serve him. And on top of all that, he was a righteous man. And then one day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. So the story shifts from a terrestrial setting to a celestial setting. We're now in heaven. One day the angels came, and Satan also came with them. Now, Satan is used here with a capital S. It's an uppercase, which makes this name or this word a proper noun. It's a name. But now, early in Old Testament times, God was not so much in competition with the devil as we come to have known that character, the devil. The devil as a character developed in biblical literature much later on in the chronology. In the early Old Testament times, God was in competition with other gods, gods like Tammuz and Baal and Asherah and others. So when you see the name Satan here, it could be as easily rendered with a small s, Satan, and with an article in front of it, the Satan, because the Satan means the accuser, the accuser. And I know this is going to be a little bit of a stretch for some of us, because this Satan is not the fallen angel who we later call the devil. This is not the Lucifer who led a rebellion against God and drew away 1/3 of the angels and was kicked out of heaven and was banished to earth. This is not the same character. This Satan, the Satan with a small s, is a servant in God's court. He is like God's district attorney who lays charges and sometimes metes out punishments to those who deserve it. He moves freely back and forth between earth and heaven, and he has these conversations with God, which are relatively amicable. This is not the same person of the devil. Now, later on, when the devil as a character became the main opponent to God, then we retroactively use the name Satan with a capital S to refer to that character. And we associate the name Satan then with the devil. But in this story of Job, this Satan is not the devil. Now, he's a bad guy. Yes, okay, fine. He is not a very desirable character. But anyway, so the Satan speaks with God, and God says to him, hey, in your travels, have you come across my servant Job? He is blameless. The man is wonderful. He's very faithful to me. And Satan says to him, of course, he will be wonderful and he will be faithful, because you're bribing him. You're giving him all this livestock and prospering his life, and he's prominent and he's having a wonderful life. Why wouldn't he be praising you? And then God says to him, he says to God, he says, if you took away those things, he wouldn't be faithful anymore. He wouldn't be that wonderful, righteous man that you take so much pride in. And so God says to him, okay, fine. I'll let you take away all the stuff that you say I am bribing him with and see what happens. And so right then, Satan returns to the terrestrial sphere, and we see what is happening with Job. In quick succession, within minutes, a messenger comes to tell him that all his livestock has been taken away by the Chaldeans. And within a minute after that, another person comes in to say, all the servants were put to the sword. And finally, another messenger comes in and says, your 10 children were having a party at the older brother's house, and a breeze came, blew the house down and killed them all. Now, every one of these messengers that came ended up saying the same thing. One said, all your cattle and everything is gone, and I am the only one that's been saved to come and tell you this story. Every one of them has the same repetition of the same statement. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Again, this is a hallmark of a folktale, because every single time, these 4 times in this story, you have the same words repeated identically. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Then in verse 20 of Job chapter 1, it says, at this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, and you see here, Job has just been traumatized. And so what does he do? He resorts to poetry, because poetry is a spontaneous overflow of very strong feelings. At this, Job got up and tore his clothes, and he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Wow. Now, in literary terms, we refer to this kind of a situation as dramatic irony. Dramatic irony occurs when we as an audience or as readers, we know something about a character that he or she does not know about himself or herself. In this case, Job is a key player in a cosmic drama, but it is a drama in which he is blind to the very scope of that drama. He is not privy to the fact that Satan and God had a conversation regarding him in heaven. He is not aware of the fact that there is a bet being placed upon his behavior and his performance. He is totally blind to the wide scope of this cosmic drama in which he is a key player. And that is what we mean by dramatic irony, because we are aware. We see the bigger picture. We see the cosmic significance of what he's doing. But all he can see is a loss of everything he ever owned, and eventually a loss of his own health. He is totally blind to everything else except his own suffering. And yet, he is faithful to God. And the point here is that we who have a better view of the bigger picture, we who are privy to the cosmic implications of his situation, we then have even more reason then to be faithful and to be supportive of our belief in God, because we have a better perspective on this than Job himself does. And I think perhaps if there's one takeaway from this whole book of Job, that is perhaps one of the key principles that we would need to look at. Now, at the end of the dialogue, we are told, and I'm reading at the very end of the book, it says, after this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children down to the fourth generation. And so he died old and full of years. In other words, and he lived happily ever after for the rest of his lifespan. And you'll notice here that the number of sheep he had, the number of oxen, the number of donkeys, all his livestock, everything is doubled at the end of the story. He gets double whatever the number was at the beginning in chapter 1 and 2. It's doubled in this last chapter. And he ends up having another 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And they're said to be beautiful daughters. And so he had everything restored. And we have our happily ever after kind of ending, which is typical of a folk tale. Now, when we get to the part of the book where Job's, after the loss of all these many things, we see that Job's 3 friends come to sit with him and to commiserate with him. It says here, Job's friends came to see him and they sat with him. I'm trying to find the exact verse. When they saw him in distress, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their clothes and sprinkled dust on their feet, and they sat around him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said anything to him because they saw how great was his suffering. 7 days and 7 nights, and they never said a word to him. You know, I don't know about you, but I used to have a real problem visiting people in the hospital, seeing people in pain or in distress. I found that very uncomfortable. I found it very awkward to be visiting even a close friend in the hospital. And you know, I just felt so useless. I'm sitting there like a bump on a log. I cannot offer any relief from the pain. I cannot do anything to speed up the healing. I am just there and I feel useless. And then sometime later, I ran into a friend who happened to be a chaplain at a hospital. And I said to him, man, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say when I visit people in the hospital. And then he said this, he says, I don't have to even say anything when I'm visiting a person in the hospital. He says, my ministry is a ministry of presence. My presence there for this person whose life has been turned upside down, my presence represents stability. My presence represents comfort. My presence represents support. My presence is there to suggest that normalcy will come again. He says, I don't even have to say anything really, although I do speak to them. And somehow that put a whole different perspective on my view of visiting friends or acquaintances in the hospital, because my presence alone can be therapeutic. If Job's friends had just sat there for another 7 days, they probably would have done a whole lot more good than if they opened their mouths to talk. Because what they did was to begin to defend what they thought was God's position on this. You see, in those days, the prevailing school of thought was what was referred to as the wisdom theory. The wisdom theory says that God is all powerful, and God is the source of good, and God is the source of evil. And if you obey God and are faithful to him, you will be blessed. You'll be prosperous. You'll have a great life. If you disobey, do not support God's will for your life, then you'll be punished. You will suffer. And so when Job's three friends come to him, it is with this mindset. And so they say all the time, and of course, for 39 chapters, which we're not going to go over, basically what they say to him is, listen, you are guilty. You should repent. If you repent, maybe God will restore you. If you refuse to repent, you're just being plain stubborn, and God's punishment will follow you. And this is the basic tenor of their argument for 39 chapters. In so many different ways, they say the same thing. And each time, Job protests his innocence. Matter of fact, he is vehement in saying, God is persecuting me. He accuses God of unfairness sometimes. He says, sometimes God blesses even the wicked. And why is he doing this to me? And so all the way through, this is a debate in poetry. And by the way, C.S. Lewis regards this as the highest form of poetry in the Bible. This is considered top-notch poetry. Now, I'm not a biblical scholar. I don't understand Hebrew very well. So I just have to take C.S. Lewis's words for it. But he suggests that this is the best kind of poetry you can find in the Bible. But to my mind, it's a little bit repetitive and a little bit tedious. But basically, Job's friends are trying to tell him, look, you must examine yourself because you're doing something wrong, even though you won't admit it. And the sooner you do that, the better. You see, God as the source of good as well as evil is something that maybe we are a little uncomfortable with, but the Old Testament is replete with many, many different examples of God being the source of evil. Amos chapter 3, verse 6, when a trumpet sounds in a city, do not the people tremble? When disaster comes to a city, has not the Lord caused it? Interesting. Deuteronomy 32, verse 39. See now that I myself am he. There is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand. Interesting. And 1 Samuel 18, verse 10, a reference here to Saul. Now, most of us know that Saul had a mental illness. Saul, Israel's first king, had a mental illness. Modern psychologists diagnose his illness as some kind of a bipolar disorder. But in 1 Samuel 18, verse 10, it says, the next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. So you see, back in those days, in that time, that's what they thought. Now, looking at these two separate pieces of literature, the folk tale and then the poetic dialogues, which constitute the debate, we see that these are actually two separate compositions. They are very different in a lot of different ways. For example, not only are there differences in terms of genre, but when you look at references to God in the prose part of Job, God is always referred to as Yahweh. Whereas in the poetic dialogues, he referred to as Eloah or Elohim or El Shaddai, the Almighty. So there are differences in the names of God in these two separate pieces of literature. Also, Job's attitude is different. Job's attitude is quite different in one instance than it is in the other. In the prose part of the book, he is very patient. He says, shall we accept blessings from God and not accept any kind of suffering? He doesn't use the word evil. He says trouble in the NIV. But in the debate part of the book, he is patient, yes, but he's also defiant. He says, I deserve my day in court. I want my charges to be in writing, and I will put them on my head like a crown, and I will wear them. I demand a hearing. And he is not only patient, but he's really defiant in that part of the book. So when we speak of the patience of Job, we're probably referring more so to the oral tradition part of it than we are to the poetic dialogues part of it. Then the reward is different. In the prose part of it, he gets double his former wealth. He gets new children to replace the ones that died, and he gets praise from God. But in the poetic dialogue part of the book, my goodness, God kind of grinds him into the ground with a series of rhetorical questions like, who are you to be asking me questions like this? Were you here when I laid the foundations of the earth? Were you here when I cast the stars into their places? Were you here when I limited the range of the rivers and the oceans and the ponds? Where were you when all this was done? How dare you ask me questions like this? You see, it's as if, who are you, human, to be questioning me? So there's a very different attitude toward Job in the poetic part of the book than it is in the prose part of the book. And that's kind of interesting. So when we get to the end, the explanation for suffering is different. In the prose narrative, it suggests that suffering is a test of faith, and God rewards those people according to their merit, according to their trust in him. Whereas in the poetic dialogues, suffering is a mystery that cannot be fathomed or explained. It cannot be fathomed or explained. In other words, this is not something that we can solve and understand and find a rationale for. This is not something that will have much of a closure in. Now, looking at this whole book, we find perhaps 4 different views of suffering. Satan's view is that people trust God only when they are prospering and not suffering. We could talk about whether that's ever true, never true, partially true, or Job's 3 friends. The whole song, the whole refrain that they kept reiterating, suffering is God's punishment for sin. If you're suffering, you must have done something to deserve this, because God punishes those who are not obedient to him. Then there's Elihu. Now, I didn't mention Elihu before, because we always hear about Job's 3 friends. But there's actually a 4th friend. Elihu is a younger character, and he is introduced close to the end of the book of Job. And I am told by those who know that Elihu's poetry is inferior to the poetry of the 3 friends. And there's a different style of writing involved here. And even his arguments are not as well articulated as the 3 friends of Job. So it is obvious, quite evident, that Elihu was a later addition to the book of Job. It was not part of the original writing of Job. Someone felt, well, there's more to be said on this, and Elihu was used as the vehicle for expressing those ideas. It's also interesting to note that at the very end, when God and Job and the three friends are discussing the whole issue, God makes mention of Job's three friends and totally ignores Elihu. Again, this is evidence, I believe, that Elihu was a later addition to the book of Job. So Job is a composite of oral tradition shown in the prose part, and of course the poetic dialogues, which includes the three friends as one source, and then Elihu is another addition to that. So Job is a composite of at least three different sources to comprise the book. Then finally, at the bottom, based on the poetic dialogues, it suggests that one of the view of suffering that we should look at is suffering causes us to trust God for who he is, not what he does. You remember Job says, I've heard of you, God, and people have talked about you, and now that I've seen you, that's enough for me. I don't need answers. Apparently, I do not need any more than that, because I've seen you and I've experienced you, and that's enough for me. So that then is an overview of the book of Job. And the question now is, how do we relate to all of this? What is the answer? Is there one answer? Should we look at life first through the eyes of faith, or should we look through the eyes of reason? And one of the conclusions that I came to after looking at this book is that our view of suffering is dependent primarily on our view of God. What is the nature of God? What is God like? And of course, there's a whole spectrum of views on deity, on the nature of deity. What I've done is to summarize what I believe to be some of the whole spectrum of views on who God is, because who you think God is will influence how you understand this particular dilemma that we have of theodicy. First, of course, we have polytheism, the belief in many gods. We had the whole pantheon of Greek gods with Zeus and Apollo and a host of others. And then, of course, they were succeeded by the pantheon of Roman gods when the Roman Empire gained prominence in the world. And so instead of Zeus, we have Jupiter, and there are other equivalents of the previous pantheon of gods. Poseidon was the Greek god, and Neptune was the Roman god equivalents. And then, of course, when the Roman Catholic Church became prominent, we have a whole pantheon again of demigods that we call saints. These are not equal to God, of course, but there are some Catholics who actually pray to the saints, who actually pray and claim to have answers to their prayers. So there's polytheism as one option. In the case of polytheism, most of the time, human suffering occurs because humans are caught between the crossfire of one god and another who is in conflict. So in the Greek tragedy called Oedipus Rex, we have Tiresias, who was a mortal, who was a favorite of the god Apollo. And Apollo granted Tiresias, his favorite mortal, the gift of prophecy. But then Apollo was in conflict with another Greek god. And so the Greek god could not reverse the gift of prophecy that Apollo had endowed, but he made it so that even though Tiresias may prophesy and what he said would be true, but no one would believe him. So here is poor Tiresias caught between the conflict of two gods. Nowadays, we as Christians, we recognize that some of the atrocity, some of the trauma that we see is a result of the great controversy between Christ and Satan, and the great struggle between good and evil. We are caught in the middle, and sometimes we become victims of that conflict. Then, of course, there's monolatry. Monolatry suggests that there are many gods, but I worship only one particular one. So it recognizes other gods. There are times in Israel when people were in this situation of monarchy, because you remember the big showdown on Mount Carmel when Elijah says you either believe in Baal or you believe in Yahweh. And that was an example of people having to make a choice based on monarchy, really deciding who to worship, recognizing that there was not only one God, and there have been other gods. Then, of course, we come to monotheism, the belief that there is only one God, one true God. And then, what is the nature of that one true God? There's a school of thought called deism. Deism suggests that God created this world, and then he wound it up and left it to run on its own devices. Deism suggests that God is an absentee God. Now, most of the founders of this United States, most of the founding fathers were deists. They were not Christians, although evangelicals would like to do some revisionist history and declare that this country was founded on Christian principles. Not necessarily. There's only one founding father who was a declared Christian, and that was John Jay. The others were believers in God as creator, yes, but they were deists. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, all these were deists. They believed that we are on our own, which brings us back to the title of our presentation today. Are we on our own? Deists believe that we are on our own. Then you have agnosticism, which suggests that we don't know if there is a God, and we don't think we have any way of knowing that whether or not there is a God. The Dalai Lama, which I mentioned earlier today, he is an agnostic. He says, when asked if there is a God, he said, I don't know. He says, it is not possible to know one way or another whether God exists. He's an agnostic. And then there's the skeptics. The skepticism doubts that there is any kind of a God. And then, of course, at the other extreme, you have the atheists. Atheism suggests that they know that there is no God. So you have a whole spectrum of belief in God. And so the choice is ours as to whether any of these should be the basis for which we try to answer the question posed by theodicy. And so I've been talking now for almost an hour, so maybe I'd like to stop at this point and see what reactions we get from you. If there are any biblical scholars in our group, I would love for you to weigh in on any of the things that I've mentioned so far, whether to elaborate or to provide a different perspective. I'd be happy to have that. I might learn a thing or two, I hope. Also, I'd like for us to, if possible, since it is said, that in every life, a little rain must fall, I'm sure that all of us at some point or other have had some loss, some traumas, maybe some tragedy in our lives. How did you cope? How do you cope? How have you gone through that experience? What was it that helped you to cope with that kind of trauma and that kind of tragedy? If you'll be willing to share with us, I think that may be very helpful to some of us who are either facing something similar or going through something similar. So at this point, I'd like to stop the screen share and pass this over to Gina and get some reactions from you.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. That was very interesting. I would like to hear from people who've dealt with those who suffer. I know we have physicians in our group, psychologists, pastors, chaplains, who would be professionals who deal with suffering. But as you mentioned, there are many who have suffered. And I'm just interested in hearing everyone's stories. There were a lot of interesting questions raised in the chat. And so I'm going to encourage people to raise your hands, because I think this is a topic that touches all of us. We watch the news every day. It seems like if you like, your life can become just a cliffhanger soap opera every day. What's the next horrible thing? What's the next horrible thing? And how do we cope with that? So I'm going to start with Lauren, who's actually, I think Bjorn had his hand up first. I'm going to go ahead and ask Bjorn to lower his hand, and then I'll go to Lauren after that. And then Olive, you're on deck after Lauren. Go ahead, Bjorn. Bjorn, are you there? All right, I'm going to
I
ask
think
Lauren.
we lost him. Oh, no, he's not unmuted. Okay, Bjorn, can you still speak?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
let's
Sorry.
Yeah, you're losing signal.
I was
We
trying
can't,
to
we
sign-
can't hear you, Bjorn. You're cutting
that
out.
I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you.
Bjorn, it's like you're in slow motion.
Can you guys hear me?
No. Can you check back in with
Okay,
us in a
never
bit?
mind, never mind.
Check back in with us when you have a better signal.
If you can't hear me, that's fine. I'll
We
just,
can now. We can now. Go ahead.
okay, never mind.
We can hear you now.
Okay.
Hello, Bjorn, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on a college campus and I'm not sure what the okay, good. I'm not sure what the signal's like. Dr. Alexander, thank you very much. Okay, I'll try to ask my question quickly. I was interested in the prose interpretation at the end of Job, as well as the poetry interpretation. And you said the prose one was basically that this was all a test of faith, and the poetry one, left it more open-ended, and it's hard to know what the two interpretations are there to allow us to make our own minds up in the face of the seemingly meaningless suffering. Is the Bible deliberately open-ended there so we can make our own meaning? Do you think that was part of the reason for those two interpretations?
That's a very good question, Warren. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that, but what I do know is that by nature of the books that are compiled in the Bible, that they're not one single author type of a production. In the case of the book of Job, is at least 3 different sources that were put together. So the redactors who put together the sources of information and put them together, they were not seeking necessarily to produce a single unified view of the issue. And so Job does give us mixed messages. It is up to us then to decide which is the message that's most relevant to us in our day and our time.
It's very interesting. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a very kind of troublesome topic, I think, Dr. Alexander. It's hard to know what to do with it, because as a pastor, I'm a pastor, my wife is a chaplain. Both of us have been with people in some very, very difficult times of life. And both of us went through some difficult times.
Thank you. Yeah, that answered it for me.
Okay, we need to mute Bjorn. Did we? Okay. Most of us, Carmen and I both lost our parents very young. My parents died in a single year when they were in their 50s. And I realize that's not the greatest tragedy of the world. The greatest tragedies in the world are huge, and thousands are lost at one time. You know, there's a famous saying that's attributed to Stalin, and it has a certain horrible, morbid truth to it. He was supposed to have said, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is merely a statistic." And there is something to that. You know, we say, "Oh, look at all the people who died in this hurricane," or "Look at all the people who died in this earthquake." We take our own tragedies much more personally. I don't know. I guess perhaps I'll make this comment and you can react to it. I know some of my friends deal with these things by saying, "Okay, Jesus is going to come again and fix the earth." I want to believe that. Others deal with them by saying, "Well, I'm going to die, but there's another life after this," and I want to believe that too. But in the short term, I find myself sometimes just becoming rather cynical, Horace, to the point of just saying, well, I don't know. I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to do what I can to comfort you. I'm going to sit here with you and be with you. I don't feel nearly as confident as I once did when I was young to look the person in the eye and say, God is going to answer your prayer and fix us all. I don't do that anymore. I did when I was young. I don't do that anymore. So the question is, can you still be a believer, but kind of come to the place where you just say, I don't know. I just have no idea what to say to you people. Suffer, I'll do my best to help you out, but I don't know what to say about God's purpose in all of this. And I'm not sure I understand the purpose that God has in any of this. It is a very dark and a very cynical sort of view that a lot of us end up with after going through some of these things. That's kind of my first reaction after listening to what you said.
And that's a view, Warren, that I think a lot of us have. I myself, I used to think that fine, some of my parents used to open the Bible at a certain chapter and leave it on the bed, believing that like, was it Psalm 91, where it says 1,000 shall fall at thy side and 10,000, but no harm will come to you. There are lots of passages in the Bible that we take as promises that may simply be the overflowing of strong feeling of confidence in God, but not necessarily a promise that no harm will come to us. The martyrs that suffered at the stake, what does that say about them? Were they not believing and trusting God to protect them? If we suggest that there may have been something that they did that made God choose not to save them, I don't know. You see, in the example of Job, though, Job can only see his boils and his sores and his loss of livestock, and his wife is saying, curse God and die. Why are you hanging on to your faithfulness to God? Well, still he persisted in his belief and trust in God, even though, of course, he didn't die either until a ripe old age. But the whole idea is to trust. Now, I am caught between two beliefs, so to speak. And maybe I can pull this up on my screen share again. Okay. I'm trying to decide between these two issues. Let me see if I can move this forward here. Yes, here is Sir Thomas Aquinas, who says, understand that you may believe. And I am leaning more toward, I'm trying to get the right, here. To your left. Sir Thomas Aquinas says, understand that you may believe. St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, a noted Catholic scholar, says, believe that you may understand. The question is, what do I lead off with? As an academic, I want to understand so that I can believe. But sometimes a cleric will tell you, first you need to believe, and then you may understand. And right now, my leaning is toward Thomas Aquinas. I'm saying, look, I was given a brain. Faith and reason are twin gifts from the same God. I should not have to ignore one to accept the other. And so my point of view is, I want to understand. I believe to lead with reason. And when reason can take me no farther, then I take a leap of faith. That is my position. So when there's a New Year's Eve party and the party's over and it's time to go home, I check into the nearest hotel because I do not want to be on the road at 2 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Eve, because there are too many drunk drivers out there. So all I'm doing is minimizing the risk. I'm using my reason, and then I'm using faith that I'll be safe in the hotel in which I'm checked in. That's the best I can do. I can do no other. I don't know what else I could do.
And how do you react though when we see, you're reacting intelligently to a comprehensible situation. I don't see a comprehensible situation in that earthquake in Turkey, for example, or the one that happened last night. There's nothing these people could have done. There's no understandable reaction to that. This is pure result of evil in the creation in the world, and people are suffering terribly because of it. I don't have an answer for any of those things, and generally I pray with people and I ask for God's help, but I really don't try to give them any understandable answer.
I think I just hit the wrong button. I was trying to get Olive to unmute, but I had her lower her hand by mistake. Are you there, Olive? Can you unmute?
He's there.
Go ahead. Can you join us, Dr. Hemmings, and share your thoughts with us?
Yes. So, just this morning, I was getting another of those AI generated signs of the time, preachers stuff, I have a sister that she just wants to burn down the whole world. The whole world must come to an end soon. And a lot of us are like that. And, we're saying, some people, we experience suffering in life, and we experience ups and downs, and we just want the whole world to burn down. And I think that was not Job's attitude, but you can correct me that if it's not so. I think Job is saying that life is what life is, and I'm dealing with it as it is. And I think sometimes we try to answer the question, why this earthquake, why that? There are some things we do not understand. The natural human inclination is that we must be able to explain everything. We must be able to control everything. We must be able, but that is all futile. And I think we should learn that from now. There are some things we have choice, we can control. As you said, I can control whether I go out and drive drunk and die, but there are just some things that we just have to deal with. But if you want, I don't know how you compare, Dr. Alexander, the apocalyptic literature that we see came in the scriptures, and Job, for example. Job, that dialogue there came out of suffering. Apocalyptic literature, again, arose out of suffering of a community, a way in which they make sense of the suffering. And I guess a lot of people are not willing to see that, so we keep setting dates as to the end of time and when the world will come to an end and when God is going to come and destroy it all, when what we're looking at is a community that is trying to make sense of their suffering in the apocalyptic text. So how do you compare that with Job, who was an individual in suffering, or is in his own individual community in suffering? How do you compare that with his approach to his suffering?
Interesting question, Olive. But that opens a can of worms, quite honestly, because apocalyptic literature in the Bible, especially in the book of Revelation, for example, is, and I guess I'm going to show a little bit of a radical side of me right now. The book of Revelation was written to 7 specific churches in Asia Minor. They were there, and the cities that the letter was sent to these are physical, actual, real communities that the book of Revelation was sent to. And believers there were under the bondage of the Roman Empire, and they were being persecuted, and they were going through a rough time. The book of Revelation was written to comfort people in their distress and to give them hope that there would be an intervention from God to save them from their condition, and they would be rewarded for their faithfulness. But the book of Revelation turned out to be, and I know this is a radical statement I'm about to make, turned out to be wishful thinking, because those people were never relieved of their bondage until centuries later, when the Roman Empire turned Christian. By then, the persecution wasn't bothering them anymore. The way in which they were delivered from their bondage was not the way that the book of Revelation suggested that there would be a grand apocalyptic event in which Jesus would come and would deliver them and take them up to heaven. That did not happen. So in the view of some theologians, Revelation is a failed prophecy. Now, in Adventist terms, we don't like to think of it that way. So what we do is we say, if it was not fulfilled to the people to whom it was written in Asia Minor, if it wasn't fulfilled for them, it must be then that is intended for us in our time. So by a stretch, we decide that the book of Revelation refers to our end times, not to the end times of the people to whom it was actually written. So I don't find a whole lot of comfort there either, quite honestly, Alec. And I know what I've done is to open a can of worms, Lauren, but perhaps maybe someone can edify me otherwise. But that's the apocalyptic literature. It doesn't really help much. I think the book of Job is probably a more useful book than the apocalyptic literature, quite honestly.
Olive, let me interrupt and ask you, do you find the apocalyptic literature comforting as a big answer? We gotta unmute you. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, you're saying if I find apocalyptic literature more comforting? Well,
You find it-
apocalyptic literature has been a source of comfort for a lot of people suffering in the world, because it gives them a lot of hope. So, as the centuries go by, the decades go by, people within personal suffering or communal suffering have looked to the apocalyptic literature as a means. It's like we're going to escape it soon. The early church, the ancient Israelites, we're going to escape it soon because it's all going to come to an end. Whereas I see Dr. Alexander, Job is dealing with the situation. This is what it is. And yet, even though he says, he rests in the fact that God is,
Yes.
that God lives, God is. And I think that perhaps sometimes we need to teach people how to simply stand in the mystery that is God and the mystery that we ourselves are. And as I said, as a young person interacting with others, many of my own colleagues and friends, I've seen them gone through personal struggles and suffering like I have. But whereas they have been, buying into all sorts of theories of the end of the world, it's coming 2000, coming so and so, I've chosen a different path. And it's a path of simply resting in the mystery that is God and seeking God's guidance and God's strength to comfort me in times when I'm suffering. Just standing in the suffering, I've been in pain and suffering. I just simply roll in it, be in it, because that is what it is. I would not die, kill myself, and whether the world comes to an end during my lifetime or not, I don't know that is going to help me in the moment when I'm suffering. So I think perhaps we need to start perhaps just focusing on the presence of God in history, that God suffers with us. And I am an intern chaplain, and that is sometimes how I approach my patients. I say, I'm with you. I'm here. I'm with you. God is here and I'm here. And that's the only comfort I can give you now. There. Yeah.
Hey, I grew up, as did you. We all grew up with the apocalyptic being a huge part of our way of understanding the problems of the world. because my great grandma thought Jesus was going to come before she died. My grandma thought Jesus was going to come before she died. Everybody in my family was certain of that. And I find the apocalyptic, with its expectation, I don't care if you make it, as long as the expectation seems like this should happen soon, which Adventists have always done. I mean, we could live to see the 200th anniversary. We're going to be pretty old, you and I, but we could live to see the 200th anniversary of 1844. And we wonder, what does it mean for Jesus to come soon? We're preaching the soon coming of Christ for 175 years. Doesn't make any sense. And so I have a real trouble with the apocalyptic in general. And that's a really, really damning admission to make, Olive, because we live in an apocalyptic family. That's who we are and where we came from. So I'm struggling with that. And I'm sorry I took away too much time. Please, Gina, move on to Leon or unless Olive wants to.
Up next, Leon, you're up, and thank you for your patience. Go ahead, Leon
Thank
Roman.
you so very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you so very much for the presentation. Very insightful, very thought-provoking, and a lot of questions would be the best gift from this. I'm a pastor, Seventh Adventist pastor coming from Romania, and now a healthcare chaplain for the last 16 years. What I discovered with people in suffering and for my own life, God is not big enough for giving them my God. When I'm with somebody suffering with a lot of questions, I don't come with answers. I'm coming from Romanian conservative Adventism, and I thought there is a question in the Bible and in the stories and in the book of Job there is an answer for every question the humans raise. First of all, you don't give them your God. As somebody who wants to help, you are there for their journey of finding meaning, bringing all the questions without judgment, accepting them where they are. My God was not big enough. My God of joy was not big enough for my own suffering, let alone to give it to somebody else. Secondly, the God that we want to give as an answer doesn't have room because people need to acknowledge, process, and go deeper. So I am somebody said, be a presence. Oh, yeah, you said, Alexander. Thank you, Dr. Alexander. Thank you so much for that image. You are there helping them to feel supported in their process of what is going on. You don't give them your meaning. You don't prompt them to find meaning. Everybody in suffering wants to know that they are validated, accepted, loved, not judged. They want to make their own meaning and their life matters or made a difference. You cannot do it for anybody in the world. Am I there to give them definite answer about why God, why? I'm still struggling with questions. I never thought I will, but I have to admit, I'm still learning more about God, learning more about life. I like what Dr. Oliver Hemming said, he is there, I am here, and we go through it together, knowing that I am loved, accepted. Suffering is not a sign of punishment or payoff for your sins. It's an experience, a passage of life. Nobody has all the answers. Only people in that situation make meaning, if they can make meaning of what is going on, because some things you cannot make meaning of. So that was my deepest learning, not to put God in our limitations or our experiences limitations, and not think that people who seem cynical and ask a lot of questions don't believe or don't look for God. They need a God who loves, accepts, and helps them in their journey. And thank you so much for the thought-provoking and very insightful presentation.
Thank you, Leon. I appreciate your comments. I'm going to go to Emmanuel and ask him to unmute.
Yes,
All right, go ahead. Go ahead.
good
Where are
afternoon,
you coming
everyone.
to us from today? Where are you from today?
I am in New York City.
Okay, go ahead.
I am going through something right now. I have a very close friend of mine. His first wife died, stage 4 cancer. His second wife has now stage 4 cancer in the liver. I don't know if she will see Christmas. And the question I have, why we always tell people, oh, it's okay, God has something to teach you. What God wants to teach a man, he lost his first wife, stage 4 cancer, his second wife, stage 4 cancer. They say, go home, everything you want to do it because you don't have too long. Why God used this technique to teach us something?
You see, we tend to want answers, and so we arrogate to ourselves the authority to provide explanations for which we really may not have any basis at all. The most that we could do for your brother is to comfort him and be with him and be as supportive and as understanding and as facilitative as we can. And that is the true reason, actually, for church, for community, and whatever form church may take, whether it's a cyber congregation or a local congregation. But that is where we are here to help each other. You know, I'm really disturbed by evangelical preachers who say, oh, you know, the reason why we have all these shootings in schools is because of we've stopped having prayer in schools. And so they make a direct correlation between prayer not being in schools and having mass shootings in schools happening so often. And then you see a few weeks later, there's a prayer meeting going on and some believers are meeting in church and their heads are bowed in prayer, and our gunman comes in and blows 4 or 5 of them away. And all of a sudden, the evangelical preachers grow eerily silent because now their argument is blown out of the water. I think we end up trying to make explanations for things of which we are not capable and for which we have no authority. The best we can do is to be supportive as much as possible with our brethren, with our friends.
I think that's a good answer when there are no answers. I'm going to go to Dan Jett, my husband, and ask him if he will unmute and join us with his thoughts.
Yes, I'm calling from about 50 feet away from your bedroom in my little office room in Woodland, California. I don't really have a question, and I certainly don't have a personal story about the hardships I've endured, because I think, as Art has pointed out, some of us feel like we've actually won the lottery of life by the absence of all the difficult struggles that we don't have that others do have, and I've certainly had my share of good fortune with that. But I just wanted to stop in the middle of these questions and just commend our presenter, Professor Alexander, about a wonderful job doing this difficult book, which has puzzled so many people. The quality of the presentation was brilliant. Opened with exciting information, exciting references to current events. Went through the poetry versus prose analysis, and took several different directions of interesting presentations, all of which was done very casually and likably, in a way that was wonderful to hear. We don't always get a great presenter, even though the topic may be very interesting. So that's all I wanted to say. And thank you, Professor Alexander. I really enjoyed it. Would like to be a student in your class anytime.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate that. My pleasure indeed.
That was nice. I'm going to ask Art to unmute.
All right, I think I have. And Dr. Alexander, I want to thank you as well. That's a difficult topic to take on. And what I appreciate most about it is that you didn't give us some pat answers and then expects us all to sagely nod and go away comfortable. And because you left us uncomfortable, which I think the book of Job is designed to do. One of the problems I think of religions of all kinds is that they claim to know way more than they ever could know. And the Adventist Church is certainly one of those organizations. When you look at the photos from the Webb telescope and look at how magnificent the universe is, and then say, yes, and we know the God who created it. And by the way, he wants to be sure that you never eat any shrimp. This is the kind of thing that he's concerned about. Don't you forget it. And that the universe is populated with many worlds. That's not hard to believe. And those people are fixated on us. They really want to know that you're not breaking the Sabbath, for instance. That's really important to them. And they're watching you carefully to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm going to throw something out that may make us uncomfortable, including myself. Let's say that I announced to the world that I had come up with a cure for cancer. And not only did I announce that, but I went into the laboratories, carefully monitored and demonstrated by taking 10 people who were suffering with the most advanced form of cancer and utilized the method I'd come up with to cure them. And then the result would be, I'm sure that people would be clamoring to say, when are you going to release that cure to the world? And what would you think of me if my response was, I've made my point. I'm not going to use it anymore. You folks understand, I just wanted to show you that I could do it. And I'm happy with your praise. And you would think I was a monster. Mm-hmm. And let's say, and you might think, well, how many lepers did Jesus heal when he was here? And how many were there to heal? Now that sounds really blasphemous, and people might say that's a terrible thing to do and to attack God in that way. But we claim that God has the power to do all those things. And we hear stories now and again about miracles that happen where somebody's healed, and we think, oh, that's great. So, but lest you think I'm leveling a blast against God, let me say this. There are literally millions of people dying all the time around the world because they don't have access to clean water. Mm-hmm. You and I and our country and all the Western countries and a lot of others have the ability and the power to fix that problem. And we don't do it. Mm-hmm. So, we're just as bad as any God, real or otherwise, that we might attack for not stepping in and taking care of problems. I don't think I have the answers, but I think it just amazes me, the hubris and the arrogance that we use when we say, we know the truth, capital T. And I think I appreciate your presentation because you acknowledge that we do not, and that we're all struggling to try to understand. Thanks.
Thanks, Art. I appreciate that comment. And it's kind of a riff off of what Leon Roman had shared earlier about not having answers to all the questions. And I have to say, one of the things I like about Adventist today is it doesn't claim to have all the answers, but it's willing to question answers. So we don't think we have the answers to all the questions, but we're willing to question all the answers. And that's what I enjoy about this group. So I'm going to go to Bill Garber, ask him if he will unmute. Bill, are you there?
There we are.
Okay, got it.
This has been really wonderful for me to to move from trying to understand the words to trying to understand the story. I was encouraged by what Leon also had to say about not explaining, but simply fellowshipping. I was with a pastor just on the way to somewhere, and the pastor needed to stop and pay a hospital visit. And the two of us went in the room. The person was dying of lung cancer. And the pastor had some things to say, not much, briefly. When he was finished, had a brief prayer, and as we were to leave, I was just behind him, and I simply stopped and put my hand out, and the man had quite a grip. And there was a sense of his being with me as part of that grip, and that was all. There were no words, and I really have a sense that Leon was right in suggesting that fellowship rather than explanation is, and that's what was described in Job's circumstance here. The story of Job. Now, while it is true that it didn't go quite so well when his friends started giving him advice, but that time where they spent with him for some better than a day without speaking was attractive. And I when we started with this, I thought, well, here we go again, Job. But the story of Job, the summary of the story of Job is, your suffering is not the result of your inattentiveness or separation from the divine. The divine does not try to get your attention with suffering. And then, the story of Abraham and Isaac going to sacrifice Isaac. I never did sense that. I sense that Abraham misunderstood that God was asking him to sacrifice Isaac. And maybe the story, or at least the story, one of the meanings of the story is you don't have agency with God. And not even if you give God your only son, are you going to, you're going to use God in some way. No. God has the provision. You don't have to. It's the end of human sacrifice. And I love these stories, and you've been a real help to me today in realizing that that the story, not the details, is where real meaning is. And it's encouraging because right off the bat, in the beginning, the advice was, don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It'll kill you. And boy, we just keep trying to figure this good and evil thing out. And the story helps remind us that it is not up to us to try to figure this out. Thank you very much for your contribution today. It's very inspiring for me.
Thank you.
Gina, if you don't mind, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Danielle, for a particular purpose. Danielle has been working on a new podcast, and she has asked me twice now to be a guest on her podcast, and it's going to be again this week. Danielle, remind me again the name. It's a really cool name.
Burn the golden calf.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. Since I'm going to be a guest this week, next Thursday again, I am going to make sure, Danielle, that we announce it on our ATSS page. Some more people can come. We had a really good time at the first one. We talked about jewelry of all things, and a lot of people, Danielle, said, "Why are you talking about that? Isn't that a thing of the past?" And we had a really good response to the discussion. People really needed to process some of those rules that they were given when they were young, and it turned out to be. So tell me some of the more topics that you're going to be talking about on your podcast.
This week, we're covering modesty. And then the next two topics that are scheduled are 1844, where we want to get into the history of the church and how where we came from influences where we are now, particularly when it comes to a lot of these rules. And then we're going to discuss tithe. So we are looking for a guest host who is either non-Adventist or in some way not employed by the church, so they can have the freedom to truly speak their mind when it comes to tithe. But yeah, we have a lot of more topics coming up. One that we're researching right now is LGBTQI+. That will be a few months down the road, but yeah, a lot of topics.
Okay, go ahead. I didn't mean to get off track. Go ahead and engage in the discussion, but I wanted to make sure we told people that we are, I was going to say cooperating, or would the better word be colluding in this podcast. Go ahead.
My goodness, like everyone else, I have suffered, and so you resonate very much with the stories of others who have suffered. And I remember reading Night by Elie Wiesel, and it was a story of Nazis going to hang, died by hanging, and unfortunately the child was so light that he didn't have enough weight to pull down the rope, and so it took half an hour for him to die. And in the book, Elie Wiesel says that behind me, I heard the same man asking, "Where is God now?" And I heard the voice within me answer him, "Here he is. He is hanging here on this gallows." And I had to stop right there reading the book, because there was a part of me that wondered if that could be true, and if it was true, what a different perspective it is on suffering. Because so often we see God as standing outside of our suffering, as an observer of our suffering. But when I look at scripture, God presents himself as someone who suffers with us, who created all of this, knowing that if freedom of choice was given, suffering would ensue, and yet did not divorce themselves from the suffering, but truly came to suffer with. And so I wonder if what others have been saying about fellowship is true, not just with each other, but also with God, in that when we suffer, God is with, and God also suffers. God does not divorce themselves from our pain, that if God is love, then God also suffers along. And I remember once thinking to myself, almost in sympathy of God, and a few years, I'm about to lose my mind. In this one little life. God, and see every story hardly hear me? Okay. To see everyone's story and to feel everyone's pain and to sympathize not just with those who have hurt, but those who are doing the hurting. Like how could you hold it? And perhaps that is the testament God is being so big enough to hold it all, to see it all, to bear witness to it all, and be with through it all. And that, I think, is one of the only things that brings me comfort at this point. The idea that perhaps God is still with.
All right, Danielle, we had some difficulties with hearing you part of the time, but I just heard the end there. Would you like to respond, Dr. Alexander?
Well, I couldn't hear everything you said, Danielle, but I did catch a few phrases here and there. You were referring to the fact that God is with us in our suffering, that God empathizes with us, that he suffers along with us. Now, I realize that we have, an anthropomorphic view of God. We have conceptualized God in human terms, but that gives me a little bit of a problem in accepting wholeheartedly, because if God has foreknowledge, as we deem him to have, how can he then feel the immediacy of my pain when this is not happening to him right when it's happening to me? So to what extent can he empathize and sympathize and feel my pain the way I'm feeling it? That's maybe I'm overanalyzing this. Maybe I'm suffering from the paralysis of analysis or something, but that is one of the questions that I've had as to how can God feel our pain when he has foreknowledge of all of this. So none of this is a surprise to him as it would be to us. And that's just one of my reactions. I don't know if I captured the essence of what you were saying.
I'm going to go to Ed Reifschneider and ask him to unmute, please. Go ahead, Ed.
Whenever I hear or engage in a discussion or read something about this topic, I feel like I have just gotten on a squirrel wheel. The wheel goes round and round and never reaches a destination. And you can get off the squirrel wheel and stop talking about it, stop thinking about it, stop reading about it. But if you get back on this squirrel wheel, you'll go round and round and round, and you won't reach a destination. And I never feel from any of these experiences that I've gotten any closer to knowing the realities that are out there somewhere in the mist. So I'm going to get off the squirrel wheel at 2:00 Mountain Time today when this is over. And I'm asking myself, where will I be when I get off the squirrel wheel? What kind of a spot will I land on? Will I have any better insights? And I'm going to be in that spot wherever it is until the next time I get back on the squirrel wheel and we discuss this again, or I read about it again. When I get off, I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a lot of ambiguity. There's going to be a lot of puzzlement. And there's going to be a lot of the unknowable. So what's the place I should land at 2:00 today when I jump off the squirrel wheel once again? And how should I hold these things in my mind? What attitude should I have in the time between now and when I get on this squirrel wheel again? Because I probably will in some way. Do I just have a kind of a fatalistic attitude? Do I have a rather Buddhist attitude? Do I just have a total blank? I have no idea what it all means or how it works. Where should I land at 2 o'clock today?
Dr. Alexander, you want to take a crack at that one?
What you're saying is very true. And yet we always have to strive for an answer if we can. And I think perhaps in exploring the issues as we have, we are at least acknowledging the problem and trying to solve the problem. My takeaway from most of this, if there's anything to be taken away, is that I have a personal responsibility to do the best that I can, giving my limited knowledge and experience, to make this life a meaningful life. And so I try to have every day 1 or 2 moments of meaningful human existence, whether it's enjoying a sunset, having a conversation that leaves me feeling loved and appreciated, doing something that a talent that I have that makes me feel like I'm making a difference for the world in which I live and the world that will be here after I am gone. So the whole point is to come down to having a meaningful life. And that is what I'm trying to do. And I'm fortunate in that my career as an educator, I feel as if I've managed to make a difference in the lives of many young people. One of the reasons why I left administrative work after around 18 years or so of that is to return to the classroom where I can have a direct impact on the lives of people. And I think if my life ended when I'm 100 years old or it ended earlier, if it was a meaningful life, then it was worth living. And that's my conclusion.
I agree with that. And I imagine all of us want to have a meaningful life in some way, a life of value to others and to ourselves. That doesn't help me much with the theodicy ambiguity, however, which is the squirrel wheel that I think we get on this subject. And maybe that's just where we have to leave it. We don't know, but let's lead a life of Christian value. That's frustrating, particularly if you don't tolerate ambiguity well. And some people tolerate ambiguity pretty well and others don't. So anyway, I'm just trying to figure where I'm going to get off this worry wheel at 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Ed, for that observation. Let me just say that one of the reasons why I appreciate Adventist today and being fortunate to become acquainted with AT is that someone has said, and I really subscribe to this, I'd rather have questions that can't be answered, answers that can't be questioned.
Yeah.
And that's why I like AT.
Thank you.
I'm on board with that. Lynn Boyd, you always have an interesting perspective to share. Can you go ahead and let us know what you're thinking today?
Well, one of the problems about being here is that by the time you get a chance to speak, the points that you wanted to speak to have passed. But Ed Reifsnyder just saved me because he brought it up again. Now, I in the comments made mention of Paul Simon's Slip Sliding Away song, where it says, God only knows, God makes his plan. The information's unavailable to the mortal man. But the last stanza of that song, well, not the last stanza, the second to last stanza of that song, Ed, says, yeah, the nearer your destination, the more you're slip sliding away, which is what you just said, I think. Sort of, it's a little bit pessimistic, but this discussion has brought me back to the time when I was forced to reevaluate almost everything that I learned in my theology classes. I took theology with Lauren. He might not remember me, but I was there. And we, I don't know if we graduated together, probably not, but from the same program.
You're younger than me, I believe.
Yeah, and I thought that I knew some answers, but when I went to Africa and served in some real primitive communities, I found out that there were a lot of questions that I didn't have answers to. And it seemed that the people who had not had any advantages of education, higher education, supposedly, were way ahead of me in terms of their ability to cope with their situation, even though their situation was far more basic and simple than mine. They were and tragic many times, very tragic. They were, as Art pointed out, victims of bad water issues. All the time they were sick because they had bad water. They had a lot of infant mortality. When they had an accident, there was no doctor around to help them. It was you saw a lot of pain and suffering. And of course, then there were the the societal things that were happening, that happened everywhere, that didn't have any solutions. The rule of law was very lax, and yet they were happier in those really primitive communities. I mean, they didn't have roads, they didn't have telephones, didn't have electricity. I could contrast it directly with the urban environment where I lived in that same country, and it was a tremendous contrast. They didn't have food, for 2-3 months of the year. They had their hungry times, and they suffered. But I would go out there and I could see that fundamentally the society seemed to be happier than the urban society in which I lived, where people had lots of money, and it was really a strange thing to come to grips with. So I asked my colleague, who actually was born in that same area where we were working, and had the advantages of an education and international travel and training, how can you explain this? And it was he looked at me and he said, of course, these people know how to be happy. And then I would go to many of them were not Seventh-day Adventists, but many of them were as well. I would go to the churches, and I would see the faith that they had. I had all these questions that we're dealing with. I mean, there's some hard questions. They didn't study Job like this for sure, but they knew the story of Job and they related to it in a way that was probably very simplistic. But they had their tragedies that God did not deliver them from, and yet their faith in God was so much stronger than mine. And I grew up, and my dad was a pastor. I went to the Seventh-day Adventist education throughout my undergraduate career. Why would these people who may never have had any Christian background in their lives until just recently have a faith that was stronger than mine? This is very difficult for me to fathom. And I finally just come to the conclusion, what Jesus said: unless you become like little children, you cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven, which is what their faith was like. Very, very simple, but strong and fervent. And I learned a lot from those people, more than probably they learned from me in that regard. And by the way, getting back to my original reference to Paul Simon's song, the whole last verse of that song, if you want to look it up, is his conclusion, Ed. All he says, and he repeats it. I always thought he was just humming, but he says, I want to love, I want to love, want to love. And that's where he landed. Maybe that's where we need to land. I agree. And that's actually repeating what Dr. Alexander just said, I think. Something meaningful. I'm done.
Thank you, Lynn. I just wanted to comment on your idea of love and a comment that Dr. Alexander made earlier about the role of the church. I think my personal feeling is that if you go to church, your fellowship there should be to encourage others. It's not to pass judgment on others, to point out the flaws of others, to rag on each other, to gossip about each other. All these things are condemned in the Bible, but it seems like that is commonplace in many churches. But it seems like when I go to a church, when I feel affirmed or encouraged, or someone will be there for me or listen to me, that's when I feel like it has value. So I just wanted to affirm that with what you were saying, Lynn. I'm going to go on to Ed Zwersky, ask him to unmute. Ed, are you there with us?
Yes,
Where are you today?
I'm on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada.
You look like you're sitting on top of the world with that background, but go ahead and share what you have to say today.
Yes, okay. So without downplaying this whole topic, and thanks for the topic, I'd like to introduce the idea that a certain amount of, quote, suffering, of course, it depends, I think, on how we define suffering. Maybe some things in life are more inconvenience, or yeah. So I think it's partly a mental attitude, but in any event, the idea is that perhaps some of our suffering is based on our own expectations of how good or bad life should be. For example, if we are focused on our past, oh, this didn't go right in my life, I didn't get this, if we're always looking into the past about how bad our lives were, I guess, or some of us, I think we all do that to some degree. Or maybe we focus into the future and envision a better life, whatever we can control, I guess, in our own minds or influence. And so that is the premise. How much of suffering is actually a product of our own thinking? That's my question.
I think you make a good point there, Ed, because many of us are so preoccupied with the past that we are not coping very well with the future. As a car guy, as one of my hobbies is restoration of cars, I always think of life as a highway that we access at the on-ramp marked birth and we exit at the off-ramp marked death. And life is the journey. It's not the destination so much, it's the journey. And we have a rear view mirror that we need to occasionally glance at. But we also have a windshield in front of us that we need to keep most of our eyes on. In other words, by looking at the relative size of the windshield compared to the rearview mirror, I think that shows where most of our attention needs to be. And so if we are all preoccupied with the past, then we fail to cope adequately with the future. So let's keep looking ahead, the road ahead, and make the most of what's left of our lives. That's my view.
As a secondary part to that question, or another question is, thank you for that answer. How do we do that? I mean, it's if you've had a number of losses in your life, recently, relatives, friends, spouse, whatever, children, maybe, getting through that whole grieving process can be rather difficult, of course, and some people never, or we all never get over a loss entirely, I think. However, how do we do that? And I don't expect you to answer that one. It's just a question thrown out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some people, some Adventists, put their hope in Jesus coming again. And as we hear on this program, for example, but when is that? Like, is it in our lifetime? And so it'd be rather nice if we're going through a rather difficult time, and tomorrow or next week, next month, Jesus came and everything gets solved for us. But of course, it's not that simple. Anyways, I don't know if you want to respond to that or not. How do we do that?
Dr. Alexander, did you want to answer that?
Well, that is a question for which I don't think I do have an answer. I grew up with the hope of the second coming, just like I think most of you have. As a young person, I was just worried that Jesus would come before I got married, and I wanted to get married before he showed up. But later on, I came to realize that you have to live every day, the best you can, and maybe live in the expectation of a second coming. But I am not holding my breath. I suppose when I die, that's the moment when Christ comes, because then the next thing I might know would be Christ coming in the clouds. I don't know. This is a great unknown. There are times when I doubt the veracity of all of that, the reality of all of that. But the best I can do is live the life every day that I know I can in the most meaningful way, and doing the most good to the most people that I can. And leave the rest later, if and when we ever know, then we will. But for right now, accept the fact that we just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very valuable answer. And thinking about what Lynn Boyd raised earlier about communities with, infant mortality and poor drinking water and seasons of hunger. I mean, when you contrast that with what my husband and I refer to as, we often say we live better than the kings of old. We have flush toilets, we have electricity, we have reliable heating sources. I mean, there's a range there. And I think most of us come to accept what our circumstances are and live our life within that milieu. If in the old United States, people would live to be maybe 45 years old. That was the average life expectancy. And you adjusted your life accordingly. So I think throughout the world with pockets, people learn to adjust their expectations to what their reality is and try to live within that and find happenness. I think that's what we have to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, folks.
Linda, why don't you tell us what you're thinking today?
Thank you so much. I have a new laptop and Zoom doesn't like it, but let me see if I can quickly go through what is the essence of my question. And thank you, Dr. Alexander, for your presentation. I had a different experience with Rabbi Kushner's book. I liked it a lot. And basically, he says that there are three postulates that he says that Job was confronted with, and all three could not be true. One, that God was all powerful and everything that happened, he willed it. Number two, that God was fair and just and wanted people to get what they deserved. And three, that Job was a good man. Now, his friends told him that three was obviously inaccurate. And that's what the course of all that, poetry is about, is the dialogue among and between them. But the thing you didn't mention that Kushner does is that in chapter 40 of the book, basically in that poetic dialogue, God says to Job, if you're so smart, why don't you gird on your royal robes and see if you can't fix it and grind the wicked into dust. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that is not perhaps God saying, in essence, number one is the one that's not true. God is really not all powerful in the way that we have always considered him. What's your opinion about that?
That's an interesting question. That was the part of the book, of Kushner's book, that I didn't like, because that goes against the grain of what I was brought up to believe. God is omniscient, he is omnipresent, and he is omnipotent. He is all powerful. And that's why I thought, if all he can do is suffer with me and be with me in my bondage or my trauma, if he can't do a darn thing about it, then what kind of a wimpy God is this? Can he still be considered God if he's not all powerful? And that's why I reacted to the book the way I did. So I'm really not sure how, because I still would like to think of a God to, by definition, not only omniscient and omnipresent, but also all powerful. So
Why is that important to you?
because if I worship a God that loves me and is all powerful, I would like for him to actually make a difference in how my life goes. I don't want to think that I'm on my own, who and just happen to have a God who is there, but who might not necessarily intervene on my behalf when that becomes necessary, in my view.
But isn't that what we've been saying all afternoon, is that that's just not the reality?
Well, then that makes me question my concept of God. And that's why I presented earlier the whole spectrum of God from, from being from monotheism to deism to agnosticism, all the way to atheism. Makes me question my concept of God. I guess I have to rethink who I think God is and readjust my expectations of him or her. And that's an uncomfortable thing for me to do. I'm not really, that's not something I relish doing.
Well, because the problem on the other end of that continuum is that if God doesn't do things in the way that we think he ought to, then bitterness, disenchantment, all sorts of things that can weaken our relationship with him, I think can flow as a natural result of having, as I always say, it's like my golf game. I enjoy my golf game because I have lowered my expectations to fit with the reality of what I can do. And I'm not suggesting having a bad picture of God, but have we not perhaps placed too much emphasis on the fact that he is all powerful and that everything that happens to us is his will? I have a relative that wrote a book and asked the question, why did God give me cancer? And I rail at that. God didn't give her cancer. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I refuse to accept that.
Well, the way I live my life every day is that I know that I'm subject to time, chance, and circumstance. And I do the best I can to minimize the risks to my well-being and those around me and my loved ones. And I leave the rest, theoretically, to God. So I use my reason to the best ability that I can. And then from there, I take a leap of faith when I just cannot be taken any further with my powers of reason. So that's how I look at the whole thing.
Thank you for your dialogue. Appreciate it.
I appreciate your comments, Linda. You're stretching our thinking here, and that's always good for all of us. I'm going to jump over Lauren and go to Ron Liebert since we haven't heard from him yet. Ron, can you unmute? Ron's one of our scholars here. Can you unmute, Ron?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Thank you, Sister Jet. I couldn't let the time pass without congratulating you for such a fine presentation. And the real reason I put my hand up is to tell you that in the chat at 1:23 p.m., I think, I left my telephone number.
Okay.
And another piece of information there so that we can correspond.
Okay. Very good.
Thank you very much for a fine presentation on wisdom literature.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go to Ray and Bobby. Go ahead and unmute. Ray and Bobby, unmute, please. There you go. What have you got today?
You asked the question earlier, how have people experience pain, suffering, discomfort, or whatever, and how did they handle it? I think one of the ways, at least my way, was I had to reject quite a bit of what I was taught and learned growing up. I had to reject the fact that all of these bad things were to teach us a lesson or to help us grow that there was something better to come out of it. Well, God really had a plan for it. So this is a temporary direction change, because I was always uncomfortable with it. And it was like, if you accepted all of that, to me, it seemed like that just perpetually left a person without any comfort whatsoever. And so I just came to the point where, as I said a couple of times, stuff happens. It's part of life. We don't always have an answer for it. It just happens. And that's part of living and heading down that highway. You never know what's going to happen, but you just keep going. Now that works for me. It may not work for others, but I totally reject that idea that it's good for you.
We all hear that. We all hear those platitudes when disaster strikes, when we're struck with grief, and you're making us question a lot of that. Do you have some thoughts, Dr. Alexander?
Well, I sometimes wonder how to relate to people who, in their own way, are trying to cope with trauma and with loss. I had a distant relative who lost a child when the child was like 8 or 9 years old. And their comfort was in saying, well, God in his foreknowledge would see that when John grew up to be a man, he was going to lose his way. So God took him early. And that was their rationale. Now, I just did not comment on that. I said, if that is going to be a comfort to them, if that is their rationale for making sense of this, I'm going to let them have the luxury of that comfort. And so I didn't subscribe to the concept, but I did not oppose or try to in any way discourage them from feeling that way.
And I'm sure it's all done in the name of God, which is hard to handle. Lauren, go ahead and share your thoughts with us.
Well, I just wanted to say that I had several things, but Dr. Alexander's last thing made me really think. You know, Horace, I heard lots of things like that as a pastor. You know, pastors hear people's deepest thoughts, and I always felt sometimes I found their explanations painful to listen to. But at the same time, would I take them away from them? No way. If it works for them, I guess you sort of have to. You can't sit and argue with somebody who's grieving and says, I've got a good explanation that works for me. Mm-hmm. So it's hard. And as a pastor, and I know chaplains face this all the time. My wife is a chaplain. I've been trying to get her to join the conversation here. You face this all the time. Number two, I love your concept of living in the moment and finding as much joy as you can and doing as much good as you can. And I want to thank you for that. You've repeated it in various ways several times. Mm-hmm. And thank you for that. Number three, Lynn made me think of something when he was talking about the folks that he worked with over in Africa. And Lynn has been a great, amazing advocate for the poor. He's spent lots of time in these villages and tried to help people. And so I want to thank him for that. But something that occurred to me, Horace, is that something has changed over the course of my life in the communities that we have with one another. Mm. And what I thought of when Lynn was describing people having a lot of faith, I also thought a lot of that came from the strength of the people gathered together we don't have that very much anymore. I mean, some people do, I guess. You know, I sometimes, I don't have any children, but I sometimes look at people who have children and say, oh, they've got a community. And then they'll say to me, yeah, it's not really quite the same. I love my kids, but a lot of people are kind of lonely. A lot of us have rejected the platitudes and the explanations, and above all, the politics and the conflict in churches, in congregations. And so I sometimes wonder, where is our community? I remember a friend of mine once who said, I go to church on Saturday, I don't find any community. I go to my woodworking class on Tuesday nights. I love that. He says, it's more meaningful to me than church. We don't get into anything other than just working on carving the wood or cutting it out or how it works. And so I wonder if you have thought very much about that concept of how community relates. Sometimes I think community and the strength from the people around you can be more meaningful than explanations about how God is doing things. We were schooled from knee high in explanations. First thing our mama told us was something about, well, God has something to teach you, or you're going to find some meaning in this eventually. They told us stories about, the Uncle Arthur bedtime story sort of thing, where there was always a moral at the end, that everything worked out and the child learned a lesson. We were really schooled in that. But I think what I'm really missing at this point in my life, and I think a lot of people are, is community. So do you have any thoughts on that, Horace?
Yeah, I agree with you, Lauren, because I do not think church should be about beliefs. Church should be about people. Church should be about a support system, the social cohesion and cohesiveness of a group of people who are there for each other. Church is a whole lot more than beliefs. Church is about having people around you who are with you in the different stages of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And church also, one of the things that it does provide is that when we have certain rites of passage, we have people there who are with us and can commiserate with us and can identify with us and show their support for us. Churches for christenings and baptisms and marriages and funerals. And those special stages of our lives, some people refer to that as hatch, splash, match, and dispatch. But when we get to the end of our days, church is all about that. And I think we need to make church more about people than about belief systems, because when all is said and done, it's really the community that matters to each one of us. And when we are in our trauma, the only thing that really matters to us in that regard is the support of people. When I forgot who it was that mentioned just holding that man's hand and feeling that man's grip communicated all that needed to be said between those two human beings, that I'm here for you, I support you, I am with you in your situation. That was probably all that was needed. And I think that's really what church should be about.
I believe it too. I have often said that to myself, I guess I've written about it a little bit too, but my biggest disappointment in God is not that God does not send angels, not that God doesn't do miracles on command or answer prayers. My biggest disappointment is that Christians aren't somehow better than they are. That Christian communities aren't somehow happier than they are. The church would be the most popular group in the world if it was truly kind and loving. But I have not seen that happen very often. I hate to say that. I'm not saying there aren't really good, kind, loving communities, but you mentioned that this is something I have told people many times. As a pastor, I was there for those rites of passage. I was there when I sat with people, I counseled with them. I sat with them. When Grandpa was dying, I counseled them before they got married. I baptized their children and taught them. All of these things, which I felt, Horace, were very intimate relationships. When you sit and get somebody ready for marriage, it's just a very intimate relationship. When you sit with somebody when they're dying, that's a very intimate relationship. And I was always shocked and hurt when 6 months later, the very people with whom I shared these intimate passages would turn on me because I had said something that they regarded as unorthodox or heretical. I just blew my mind. I'm not even going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm just going to attack you. And that's where my huge disappointment in church congregations comes from. If they were truly God created organizations, I can do without the miracles, I can do without all kinds of things, that if people who came out of congregations or were in congregations really showed peace, joy, love, all those other fruits of the Spirit, we would transform the world. But I have not seen that happen, at least consistently. Am I being too unfair, Horace?
No, you're not. You're not at all. And I think we all identify with that, even though not all of us are pastors or have been pastors. Yes. One of the reasons why I left administrative work, quite honestly, is because, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. You are up there as a leader and you become a target for any person. And you, as a leader, you have to be vulnerable to your constituents, and they're not always kind. And the pastor job can be a really lonely job. You don't have, unless you have another pastor nearby to lean on and express your frustrations to. You can't talk to your parishioners. No, they look to you to comfort them, not the other way around. And that's part of the reason, again, when we have a hierarchical structure where the pastor can minister to the people, but the people can't minister to the pastor, that to me is part of the problem, because true community would mean that a pastor is first among equals. He is there as a servant leader, and he can not only serve his people, but the people can serve him in his hour of need as well. I wish we could have local churches that had that kind of dynamic, because then
me too.
Pastorship would be much more fulfilling, and membership in a local congregation would be much more nurturing, more loving. Jesus said, "By this shall men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." There's nothing about doctrines and any of the other extraneous factors. The key principle is love for one another.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. You probably heard this famous phrase. It's attributed to Niebuhr, although I don't know if he actually, one of the Niebuhr brothers, I don't know if he actually said it, but it's attributed to him. And I will warn you before I tell it to you that I don't like it. I once believed it, but I don't like it. He is purported to have said, the church is like Noah's Ark. You couldn't stand the stench inside except there for the storm outside. Have you ever heard that one?
No, that's a new one.
And when I first heard that, I thought, okay, that maybe is an explanation. I don't buy it anymore. In order for me to accept organized religion, I demand that they learn to be nice to one another on the inside.
Yes.
And I'm tired of that. I'm tired of fighting churches. I'm tired of politics. I'm tired of all of that stuff. So, hey, we're at the end here. We're going to wrap up. Gina, thank you so much. I really appreciated your help today.
Thank you. And I wanted to just say to Dr. Alexander how much I enjoyed his presentation. I wanted to make a comment here. And that is, I worked with a lot of Catholics in one job that I had. They would hire each other, more and more Catholics. We had a lot. So I was very exposed to them, and they were convinced that they were the one true church. And I've also been exposed to Baptists who are convinced that they're the one true church. And I grew up in the Adventist church who was convinced that they were the one true church. And it seems like if they were all the one true church, they would be in agreement with their doctrines, but they're not. They fight, they argue, they, want to prove each other wrong and spend a lot of energy in that direction. And I think about the comments of Paul talking about we are all one in Christ. You didn't come to Jesus or Christ through Paul. You didn't come to Jesus through Cephas or these other leaders or denominations, is how I see it. We are all one in Christ. And I think we've totally lost that. And Randy Robertson raised a question in the chat earlier, which is, what if we turned our energy into relieving human suffering? It seems to me we would be an unstoppable force, but not just our church, but the world is not interested in that. Our country is busy positioning itself, and our political parties are interested in positioning themselves. It's like, is this a goal that people would disagree with, ending human suffering, like on a global scale? I mean, it seems to me that would be, of course, undoable, but it seems like it's a better way of living your life. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Alexander.
Thank you so much for the privilege of sharing with you. I really appreciate when Lauren contacted me to say, hey, can you do this Sabbath? And I thought, hey, I'd be happy to. I appreciate AT, and AT has my support, and I do wish you all the best in the future and look forward to further interactions. So thank you very much.
And thank you for this community, by the way, all of you, the ones who are left. I should have said this earlier. This has been a community where a lot of us have felt like we could be more honest than we could be in our congregations. I've talked to a lot of you who have said that. Don't you think so, all of you?
Yes.
I think it has had that effect. We just have some wonderful people here. And by the way, some of you, invite some of your friends to ATSS. I'd like to build it up even more.